80% of autistic females are undiagnosed. 80%. That's the number I've come across in several locations. And this whole inquiry I'm doing on trying to understand the overlap and relationship between complex PTSD and autism is becoming more and more difficult, as it really does appear. In the next video I'm going to make on this topic is going to be a comparison of ASD and CPTSD. And even when I look at the different graphs and the other work of people, the more and more I read, the more this overlap continues to sort of show itself around complex trauma and autism. And nowhere is that really more clear in this debate, and it is still a debate about whether or not the highly sensitive person is actually just a profile of a type of autism versus it being a separate thing. And I don't fully know where all this lands, although I can tell you that what I'm going to share with you today is going to come from the autism side, the autism argument around highly sensitive people actually being just a type of profile more often than not of autism. That being said, sensitivity, or HSPs, often called sensory processing sensitivities, that's the sort of clinical term, SPS, are people who have a higher responsiveness to their environment, to the sensory world, a sensitivity, if you will, to sort of everything inside and outside their world. And that this exists, it's a trait, and it exists along a spectrum, and it exists in animals and different species, like it's everywhere. Up to 30% apparently of those they've studied can have this trait. It's a sensitivity trait. So that being said, I think that is one thing as we're talking about autism, because for me, one of the biggest issues is how do I understand and make sense of my sensory issues as they have existed my entire life as it relates to complex PTSD, specifically around issues like hypervigilance and what we can see are true sensory sensitivities that we may have developed over time because we're living in fight or flight, because it made sense to make meaning of these things. Maybe we're just, we were more sensitive at birth and we're also experiencing complex trauma. It gets complicated. But what I will say is that from the autistic voices I've been listening to, both on videos and TikToks and in research and articles and websites, is that their position is that the research done by Elaine Aron on highly sensitive people has some issues with it, with this regard. Number one, apparently that she based a large part of her sort of understanding and creating this profile of a person based on two of her grandnephews who were later diagnosed as autistic. So apparently, observing them really informed at least this passion and interest. Now, I've read that several places. I can't seem to find an exact quote from her, but I have seen that many places. The next thing is that when they did do apparently some comparison studies between autism and HSPs, they did not use highly masked, what we would call level 1, low support needs autistics. Basically people who would have been hard to detect without expertise that they may have been on the spectrum, especially because of the very limited way in which the DSM-5 and research has hyper-focused on very specific populations of white males and really disregarded people of color and women. So that's one thing. If the criteria are about this thing, but it leaves out all of us who don't fit in this box, that seems to be an issue. And lastly, that Elaine Aron herself had said that the two biggest reasons why they weren't the same thing initially were that one, people with autism don't tend to have empathy, which is absolutely not true. I'm going to make a video about what's called the double empathy problem, which really gets into understanding what empathy looks like in those with autism. And in fact, it's highly offensive to assume that they don't. Many of them have hyper empathy. There's a wide degree there of those and how they might not only experience empathy, but how it might be understood as the person is experiencing it. So it's not true that those who have autism don't have empathy. And secondly, that those with autism have special interests, which apparently is not always true either. and that those with HSP traits wouldn't have special interest. And so once again, we're learning as I'm going through this, so many voices are informing my views. And I want to say this, that I am trying to use, of course, those who have written books and done research studies, but I also am trying to listen to those who are, frankly, very impressive and have done a lot of their own research, who are not necessarily in academia, but who are people who have very powerful and worthwhile autistic voices to listen to. So I'm going to be pulling from lots of things as I try to understand everything. And because even if I try to only stick to the most researched dynamics, if the DSM-5 that creates that understanding of a diagnosis is missing a lot of data, is inaccurate, has presumed some things that aren't true, has left out populations, we have a serious problem. And that's what I'm learning more and more. And that's why this blend is becoming stronger, as it appears that it's relatively, an inherent part of autism can be to also experience complex trauma in many forms. So let's talk about what the HSP profile of autism looks like in the autistic community. I'm going to be referencing actually a TikTok. I'm going to link it down below, by an individual named Dr. Joey, who has 2 doctorates, one in clinical psychology and one, I believe, in clinical neuropsychology. Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure that's what they both are. And in that TikTok, they go through what the profile would look like. Now, I would encourage you to go back to my last video if you want and just look at the typical criteria on what makes a person an HSP. You could quickly Google it on your phone and just look at the characteristics. It really is about heightened emotional sensitivities, heightened empathy, heightened sensory responses to, like I said earlier, everything basically inside and outside of your world and how that impacts you. So if that were to instead be a profile of a type of autism, what I am reading is that would reflect a person who would, let's say, identify as an HSP, who was unconsciously masking, who might also be highly masking in a way that they don't even know they have autism, but they have learned to make all of these adaptations because they have enough ability to understand certain types of social dynamics so that they know that having a meltdown wouldn't be appropriate, for example, to show that they were so dysregulated, let's say, inside by something in a sensory way, that they might go home and then shut down for the rest of the night, but they're not going to necessarily show that to you in what we have thought of as more of an autistic type of behavior. So basically, the profile reflects an emotional oversensitivity and is about unconscious masking. And that as a result of all of this, as I go through it, it talks about this profile especially being especially at risk for burnout. And burnout is basically, from my understanding, I'm going to also do a whole video on this, where for many people who have been masking their whole lives and just like literally treading water to adjust and survive without drowning, that at some point it is so much that it basically forces a person at times to really lose capacity, to shut down, to become significantly overwhelmed in a way that affects functioning. And so you can imagine if, let's say, you are identifying with being a highly sensitive person, which I always have, right? That would explain the things that complex trauma wouldn't necessarily explain. And maybe it is. Maybe these are separate things. And HSP explains that with CPTSD, that I came out of the womb where you did sensitive. And then we landed in a very invalidating environment again and again and again. At the same time, when you start to kind of compare and overlap the profile of autism, especially at the core, which is so much about our sensory sensitivities, in fact, even more so than social communication dynamics, because what we're learning is that it's not a deficit to be autistic, a social deficit that you might have, your communication style. It is a difference. So you need to hold space for the idea that an autistic brain does not fit into the box of all the social worlds and all the social rules that have been constructed that said this is right and this is wrong and this is how we make a diagnosis. It doesn't make space for the fact that on this world and this planet, maybe we speak this language, but on this planet we speak that language, and neither one is wrong or right. And that also applies, as I mentioned, to the idea of empathy, that the way people might engage with each other, who, let's say, 2 autistic people versus 2 non-autistic people. There might be, and I think the research shows that there's something that's happening with, let's say, two of the same that tend to have a better way of understanding each other potentially than, let's say a different, an autistic person and a non-autistic person. So these are the characteristics. Number one, an intensity and depth of processing that reflects a rich and complex inner life and may manifest as complex imagery or deep theorizing about the world and people. And don't forget that for many people who are highly masking or autistic in general, one of their special interests is often people. That is the idea of it being psychology, like I mentioned, in the arts. Like, if your special interest is understanding how humans are supposed to be in situations, you might become much better at that than someone whose interest was not that. But the way it might manifest, which is this common thing in HSPs, having a deep interior world, that would be true, and it would look like this complex imagery and deep thinking about the world and yourself and others. Number two, a high sensitivity to sensory input. So basically what we're saying is the HSP profile of autism would be very sensitive to things like pain, hunger, touch, fabrics, clutter, temperature, having a strong startle response, sensations, light, smells, and theirs and other people's intense emotions. So everything around the senses, the volume would be very high up, which is also true for HSPs. Number three, a high perceptivity in picking up things that other people don't. So that's like being able to kind of like focus on things that others might not notice. Number four, needing accommodations for your sensitivities. But then again, if you were basically unconsciously masking, so you're an HSP autistic, but you don't know that, you're unconsciously masking and making all these adjustments in the world to show up in a certain way to get through it. But maybe you do things without realizing it, like you only buy clothing without tags. You only can use certain kind of perfumes or smells. So you've basically set up your world through what you're thinking are preferences, but really they're ways of kind of accommodating for basically what are difficult triggers for you potentially. Number five, needing advance notice to prepare for sensory sensitivities. And we've talked a lot about the HSP world being highly reactive to stress, that let's say unpredictable situations, things we can't control, that all of that would make it more difficult. So the idea is that oftentimes those who have autism will say, if I know what to expect going into it, I tend to do well. And I think that's true for most of us. I think especially we all have, wherever we are in terms of our brains, have little things we like and don't like. And being like surprised by something we don't enjoy or like, most of us don't do well with that. It's just a matter of degree. And I would say for those who have heightened sensitivities, that would be the case. The next one is enjoyment of fine scents, tastes, sounds, smells, art, things like that. And that's another one of the signs of HSPs. It's this appreciation for the beauty of life, right? For this like parts of beauty and enjoyment for the sake of what they are, like an awareness of that, a sensitivity to that, an appreciation for that. Number seven, hyperempathy with a tendency to be easily affected by others' moods. Now we know that's also part of HSP. So, and also complex trauma. We learn to pay a lot of attention to what other people are doing and thinking and feeling, and we can take that and absorb that. And in fact, there are those on the spectrum who have hyperempathy, I think, as I said earlier. So when you're hyper-empathic, there's no barrier. The volume is way up. And where there should ideally be a barrier, there isn't one. And I've talked about this a lot, but I am so affected by my kids' moods that even when I can in my head say, I know this is not anything to do with me, if they're in the back room and they're in a bad mood, it still bothers me. And I can feel the energy, and this is a good thing as a therapist and psychologist to be able to read people. And of course, working online is required a few shifts in that, but it's still, if you're an energy reader, you know what I mean, and that is also a sign of HSP. The next one is a strong desire to be ethical. So apparently, and what I'm learning about autism is that it's not necessarily a sense to be moral, but it's about a strong sense of justice, of what is right and wrong. And that would align too with HSPs in that they wouldn't be necessarily great or down with, being unsupportive of a different, community or of not accepting others. There's a lot about, or fighting for what seems like is fair and right, although I think it would be even stronger, I'm guessing, for a person with autism. Difficulties working under pressure. Now that's obviously would be expected. Anybody who has high sensitivities, that stress is such a major impactor of our well-being. And that's definitely true for HSPs and would be true for the HSP profile of autism. Difficulties with conflict. Now it just seems to reason that if you're a highly sensitive person, for whatever reason, the world feels intense and things hurt more and feels the edges are sharper, that you wouldn't necessarily like conflict. You wouldn't like negative feelings. You wouldn't like places where it doesn't feel safe. And those are true for both. Passionate about topics. So interest in psychology, the self, the environment. One of the things I think is about animals in terms of the HSPs, but it would be like this interest in things that are meaningful. And the way it would look in an autistic profile, as I said earlier, is a passion about people and how their brains work or their emotions work, or maybe love for those who are, let's say an endangered animal species, things like that. So that would obviously go further, but of course a person with a classic sensitivity profile in general would be more likely to care about others and experiences and interactions and things like that. Number 12 is susceptibility to headaches, body aches, gastrointestinal issues emerging from stress. So as we know with HSPs in that profile, in terms of the classic one, that they are going to be more sensitive to things, and those things are going to manifest in their bodies and come out in different symptoms. And that the idea is that stress would be a major driver for both the HSP and the HSP profile of autism. Number 13, difficulties are as a result of masking unconsciously and often expressed through other means such as health or mental health issues. So even though, let's say, a person with this profile who has autism is trying to do a good job of masking, it's requiring them to really sacrifice and manage and deal with all of this, like as I said kind of last time, the nails in the chalkboard all of the time while maybe not showing it. And so that might manifest in an anxiety disorder or depression, all types of issues where that might come up, or your own health issues, as we know that chronic stress is significantly related to the onset of adult issues around, as I've talked about so many cases in the ACEs studies and the adverse childhood experiences studies, where we said that those who had more childhood trauma tended to have more physical health issues as well as mental health issues. And then the last one is that the neurobiology of HSP autistics reflects an intensity of sensory processing that is consistent with autism research. So it's really more about, according to Dr. Joey and the research that they pulled together, and other people that I actually also read, that it's really about the sensory processing more than about deficits in social functioning. As I said earlier, it's not that autistic people have a deficit, it's a difference. And so if the world you were taught to speak, the language was this language, but people over here could speak that language, of course, you would not be doing a good job in this one. And so the problem is that the deficits in social functioning in autism have now been disputed by the double empathy problem. And I'm going to make a whole video about that. The bottom line about that is that it's sort of like how you're assessing empathy depends on who's having the empathic dynamic, right? So it's that maybe neurotypicals would expect it to look like this or experience it this way, and those who are neurodiverse would experience it another way. One is not right or wrong, they're just different. And so the stereotypes that are blocking HSPs from being diagnosed might be that they are just really autistics who are masking alongside a stereotype that says that, and not just a stereotype, a reality that being diagnosed with autism might bring some negative things into your life. It might bring some great things as well. But at this current time, there can be some things that could hold you back from, for example. And then even things like stimming, which we think of as a traditionally autistic behavior, that those who have HSP profiles might also be trying to find ways to deal with their overloaded sensitivities, like picking their skin or twirling their hair, or singing, things like that, or going through thoughts in their mind over and over again and reflecting. That it's really about regulating the sensory triggers and not so much about just the idea of repetitive behaviors for the sake of repetitive behaviors. And so we know that those, for example, with trauma might find ways to turn their nervous systems to manage those things as well. through what might look like different types of stimming. And I think historically we've thought of stimming as hand flapping, rocking, which of course it is, but that there are lots of ways that those with autism might enjoy stims, and might use to regulate, to deal with stress, to deal with whatever's going on, and input into their world. So the bottom line is that all of this profile, when you look at what I've read, and you think about 80% of females being undiagnosed who have autism, that is a strikingly horrific number to think about. And whether we're just, want to label this, okay, because technically HSPs are neurodivergent, just like autism creates a neurodivergent profile. Whatever it is, complex trauma is a neurodivergent profile. Our brains have to make these changes to accommodate for whatever's going on, whether we're born with it or it happens to us inherently. And so what I think is powerful about this is understanding that if you relate to this profile of being highly sensitive, even if you just want to say, I'm not willing to go into the autistic dynamic at this point, although it's pretty interesting when you listen to autistic voices, how much you hear that, is to really acknowledge how profoundly impactful the world is to you. And I've been noticing this more and more, and I'm not sure if it's because I haven't had a vacation in 2 years, which is is changing soon, but I'm finding it harder and harder to tolerate certain things. And my nervous system is getting more and more just depleted. And then you add in things like menopause, where, as I've said, I'm up at 4 a.m. every day, and that's all other conversation. It starts to wear on you. And the idea is that if you've been unconsciously masking your autism and really trying so hard to fit this round shape into this square hole, that at some point it may no longer fit and there might actually be damage from doing so, it's important to understand that however you want to identify, if you just want to call it neurodivergence, that to start to own that you need to think about, because of your sensory sensitivities, for example, how you set up your life. I made a list on my phone. I'm going to make a video about this. I couldn't believe it. This was like actually before I even did this deep dive, about how many things I set up in my life, in my home, to deal with my sensory triggers. And the list was like this long, from like how I deal with smells, how I deal with fabrics, how I, do routines, candles, lighting, like it's so much. And it's just how I am. And that goes back to what my daughter would said, God, everything bothers you. It's like my attempt to reduce the harm of being bothered. And that is what I think masking looks like. When you're trying so hard to reduce the harm to yourself, it is still harm. And so if you leave these videos just thinking about how to, change to honor the way your brain works, and that's as far as you're willing to go, that to me is profoundly impactful, and it will require that you change some things for yourself. Or what I'm finding is that your brain will change it for you. And it might manifest in burnout, in raging anxiety, which I think many people with autism have in general, but in ways that actually prohibit your functioning. I've actually started to change my filming schedule and my patient schedule I'm working on as the summer's going on, because I keep trying to fit everything in. And that's also why I don't have the specific days of when I'm posting videos. I'm trying to post at least 4, if not 5, because it was stressing me out with that schedule so much that it was like not making me wanting to do it, which is a whole other conversation. But anyway, the point is, everything from how you do your sleep, to how you nourish your body, to exercise, to how you engage in relationships or not, to your isolating or not, like all of that might need to be more protected if you begin to identify and understand that you do have these sensitivities and you do need the support. So I hope that was helpful. I'm curious to see what you think. Thank you so much for being here. Please stay safe and well, and I'll see you soon. Bye.